In this Code 0 to 20, we're going to be taking a look at multi-cursor usage in VS Code. Multi-cursors, as the name suggests, let you create multiple cursors in a file. This can be used for working with text and manipulating it in very complex ways, and once you get used to working with multi-cursors, they can become a really invaluable tool and a very important part of your workflow. Multi-cursors are definitely a more advanced technique in VS Code, and you can certainly get by without understanding them. This video is sort of targeted at people who have some understanding of VS Code, they've maybe worked in a little bit, but are now wanting to explore some of the more advanced features of VS Code and how you can be more productive when working with your code and just working with text in general. I find that I actually use multi-cursors far more than I ever thought I would, and once you get used to them and once you really see how powerful they are, you wish that almost every application supported multi-cursors. In this video, we'll start by looking at some of the ways that you can create multi-cursors, because there are a few different ways depending on what you're looking for. Then look at some of the details of how these multi-cursors can be created, some of the settings associated with them, as well as some of the associated commands. We'll also take a look at some of the behavior related to multi-cursors, such as what happens when you copy and paste using multiple cursors. So let's kick things off by looking at the multi-cursor command I find myself using most often. The add selection to next find match command is definitely a bit of a mouthful. So the way that I usually remember it and the way I refer to this command is Command D or Control D, which is the key binding for it. What this command essentially lets you do is create a multi-cursor for the next selection of the current text. So let's say that, for example, I wanted to create two cursors and have them be created for the word read only. All I would have to do is first select this text here, and now I can go, and if I wanted to, I could use Control D or Command D to trigger the add selection to next find match command, and this would go and create another cursor at the next occurrence of the word read only. So you can see VS Code is helpfully highlighting all of these occurrences. I'm just going to do Command D here, and you can see that I now have two cursors in my file. Now, this is also a good point to just kind of look at how basic multi-cursors work now that we actually have two cursors in the file. So you can see that as I actually move around here with the arrow keys, both of my cursors move. As I start typing, I type in both locations. So I'm manipulating multiple places in the file. I can even make multiple different selections in the file. And this will also work no matter how many cursors you can have. So you could have 5 cursors, you could have 100 cursors. All of these same behaviors will still work. So I can just move through, and let's say that I actually wanted to get rid of the word read only here. All I would have to do is just select it. So I could just go in here and select it all and then press delete. Or I could just go and at the end start deleting and add whatever else I wanted. So I could do like static here if I wanted. So I can just go and edit the text in multiple locations. Again, this Command D or Control D command is very useful because it lets you just think about where you want to create the next occurrence of the multi-cursor, and then just hit that Command D or Control D to go and create it based on the text itself. So you're not limited to just creating two cursors, of course. So let's say I wanted to actually select multiple instances of read only. I'll just make my selection up here and then do Command D or Control D. And every time I hit this command, it'll go and it'll create another instance of the cursor. So I could just go through the entire file, actually start hopping down here, and I can go through and select as many occurrences of this as I want. So one other thing to note, let me just go create a few more cursors, is that VS Code will actually show you in the scroll bar over here where all of your cursors are. So you can see that I have some cursors down here now, and then I have the cursors up here. So in the scroll bar, you can see this little gray indicator that is helping you understand where the cursors are in your file. So this is a good indicator of where we're actually creating the multiple cursors in the file. And as I said before, even though I have more selections now, so maybe about 10, I can still work with the code the exact same way. So I can go in here, edit all these different places in the file, make changes, make selections, do whatever I want at all these different locations in the file. All of the editing operations also count as a single operation. So if I go and I make a bunch of changes here, for example, this is all, when I press undo or redo, this will all get undone or redone at the same time because it is a single editing operation. So that's a quick introduction to multi-cursors and some of the capabilities. What you can start doing once you get used to multi-cursors is you can use these multiple cursors to really touch multiple places in the file and make more advanced changes. I often find that I use multi-cursors instead of doing more advanced find replaces using regular expressions because multi-cursors are more natural to work with, and they can be super powerful once you get used to using them. One other quick thing that I should note is that once you do create multi-cursors in a file, you can get back to having a single cursor either by pressing escape or just by clicking anywhere in the file. So let's say I create a few cursors here, go in and I realize, hey, I actually don't want to have these multi-cursors anymore. I could just press the escape key. Now I'm back to having a single cursor, or I could actually just go click somewhere in the file and I'll go back to having the single cursor wherever I clicked in the file instead. Now, one helpful supporting command related to Command D or Control D is actually the cursor undo and redo commands. So these let you either undo the creation of an extra cursor or redo the creation of that cursor after you've undone it. So let's go in here and say I want to select read only again. I'll just go and say Command D or Control D a few times here. So I'll create multiple cursors. Say I'm going through the list and whoops, I created one too many cursors and I actually want to get rid of this cursor that I just created here. So you can use the cursor undo command to do that. So I'm going to open up the command palette with Control Shift P or Command Shift P and say cursor undo. And you can see I have a key binding for this. This would be Command U here on Mac. So I'll just do cursor undo. And now instead of having that extra cursor that I created here, we're back to just having the 4 original cursors. Of course, there's also a cursor redo command. So I'll open up the command palette again and say cursor redo. And now we go back and we have that extra cursor down here at the bottom. So you can just undo and redo the creation of cursors like that. That's especially helpful, I find, when you're using Command D and you're wanting to make a certain number of selections in a file and you realize that you created one too many and you want to go back a step or two. There's also an add previous selection to next find match command. So this would let you can see here that with Command D or Control D, we're going down in the file. We could actually go up in the file instead. So let's say I was on this read only. I select this and I want to add the read only above it to the in creating multiple cursor there instead. So all I would have to do is run the add previous selection to next find match. So I'm going to open the command palette with Control Shift P or Command Shift P, say add previous selection or add selection to previous find match here. And when I run this, you'll see that it created the cursor above my current position instead of below the current position. So just having these commands available that can be useful. But again, the ones I find myself using most often all the time is just normal Control D or Command D, and then maybe a cursor undo if I create one too many things. One important detail about the way that Command D or Control D actually works is that it can obey both the case sensitivity rules and the words break rules of your find replace widget in VS Code. So let's just demonstrate that. So I'm going to go and create a word here. So I'm going to do an uppercase read only. And you'll see that when I run Command D normally, it will actually go through and it will make that selection on that uppercase read only as well. And when I'm going through and I'm actually making this selection, one thing you'll notice is there's this little widget that actually shows up over here. And that is indicating that there are currently no settings that are being applied to the Command D or Control D action when I'm going through here. So it is case insensitive, and it will try to match just this text without any case and without requiring that it appear as its own word. So we had something like read only appear in the middle of this word here. We would also go through and select that, and then again we are ignoring case. Now, if we actually go and we interact with that little widget over there, we can make the multi-cursor selection case sensitive, so they would always try to preserve the case of the original selection that we had. And we can also make it so that it would only try to match whole words. So if the word we're targeting appears in the middle of a word, we would actually skip over that. So let's look at case sensitivity first. So I'm just going to make a selection here, press Control D or Command D. Now I'm going to go over here to this widget and enable case sensitivity. So I'm going to click on this little A here, match case. This would also show up if I go into my find replace widget here. So I've now turned on match case. And now when I go back to Command D or Control D, so let's press that here, it will actually skip over any occurrences of that same text that do not match the same case. So just by changing that little setting there, we're actually able to change the behavior of what Command D or Control D is doing. Now, a similar setting exists for matching the entire word. So let's go take a look at enabling that. So I'm going to press Command D again, get that little widget up. I'll turn off case sensitivity, so now we're going to be case insensitive again. And instead, I'm going to turn on this match whole word setting here. So again, you can also just bring this up from the find widget. So I'm going to have match whole word on. And this means that we will always try to match the current selection only if it appears as an individual word. So right now with read only in the middle of this text, we will skip over that. So I'm going to press Command D here a few times. And you can see that we have skipped over the occurrence of read only here because that match whole word setting is on. So match whole word can be super useful if you're wanting to restrict the selection to just words or just like the keyword read only here, for example, because then you would skip over the same text that appears in any method names or things like that. For now, though, I'm just going to disable both of these settings so we get back into our original state. So I'm going to, again, just open the find widget and turn off match whole word. So we're back in the default state of VS Code, which is case insensitive, and it is only matching the text no matter where it appears. Now using Control D or Command D we could actually go and select every occurrence of some given text in a file if we wanted to. So I could go and say, let's go select read only here. And if I wanted to select all occurrences in this file, I could just mash Control D or Command D. So I could go Command D, Command D, Command D, Command D, until I get to all occurrences in this file. But for a fairly long file like this one, that's going to be super tedious and nobody really wants to do that. Thankfully, VS Code includes a command that will help us out here. I'm just going to clear my current selection with escape, go back to my original selection up here, and instead we can use the select all occurrences of find match command. And as the name suggests, instead of just selecting the next occurrence, it'll select all occurrences in the current file. So I'm going to go make my original selection now, and then I'm going to open the command palette with Control-Shift-P or Command-Shift-P and say select all occurrences of find match. You can see there is a key binding available as well. So let's do select all occurrences of find match here. And now, sure enough, as we scroll through the file and as we glance over at the scroll bar, we can see that there are cursors for every occurrence of the word read only here in this file. So it just has gone through and created all these cursors for us. Again, we can still edit in the file just fine, even though we have quite a few cursors now. So I could get rid of all the read onlys if I wanted to. I could add a bunch of gibberish in their place. I could even go and instead of going at the start of the line here, I could go to the end of the line. And now I've gone to the end of the line for all of these different cursors by using a keyboard shortcut. And I could go and start editing up here if I wanted to. So you can get really creative with your multi-cursor usages. And now I'm editing at all these different points in the file all at the same time. Again, this command also does have a key binding available. So on Windows, the key binding is Control-Shift-L. On Mac, it would be Command-Shift-L. And this is a useful key binding to memorize because just like Control-D or Command-D, it can come in handy quite often. So let's say I wanted to select everything again. I could just select that and then press Control-Shift-L on Windows or Command-Shift-L on Mac. And now I've done the exact same thing using the select all occurrences of find match command there. Creating multiple cursors based on textual matches in a file is how I find myself using the multi-cursor feature most often, but there are plenty of other ways to create multiple cursors in a file as well that do not rely on matching text. For example, we can actually use the mouse to go and click in specific locations in the file to create an extra cursor there. Say, for example, we wanted to go and edit the two property names here. So let's just do the first two properties in this file. We want to actually edit the name. Now, one option would actually be to look here and say, hey, these both have little colons here. So we could use Control-D or Command-D to create multiple cursors there. But that's a little bit hard to discover, and there might be other colons in between. So if we had one like in the middle here, like an extra colon there, we would want to skip over that one. And Control-D or Command-D, it's not really possible to do something like that. Using the mouse instead gives us better control, and we can actually pick specifically where in a file we want to create that cursor. So to start with, I'm just going to place my cursor where I want my first cursor. So I'm going to place it right at the end of this method name or this property name. And then I'm going to hold down either the Option key on Mac or the Alt key on Windows and Linux and click in the file where I want to create the other cursor. So let's go and click at the end of this second property. And you can see that I've now gone and created a second cursor here. So again, all I did was hold down the Option or Alt key and then click where I wanted to create that other cursor. And now I can go in and start editing these two properties however I want here. I can go and make some prefix or suffix here. So I can do all sorts of things. And again, I was able to manually select where I wanted the multiple cursors. You can also create many more cursors than just having two, of course. So I could go in here and let's say that I wanted to create multiple cursors on this line for some reason. I could go in and just start clicking with Option or Alt, create a whole bunch of cursors here, and really edit this line and really mess it up quite a bit using that. But this lets you make individual selections and choose where specifically you want the multiple cursors in a file. One common use case for this would be selecting at specific points in the file where you want to make an edit. So I could go in here and say, I'm going to change the name iFileService here. I'm going to change it up here, for example, and maybe I should also change it there. Then I'll scroll down a little bit, and I'm also going to change this one because that seems like something I should change, and this one as well. So I've made specific selections of where I want to create these multi-cursors, and then I could go in and again start making the changes just like that. And if I scroll up here, you can see that all of those specifically picked locations have been updated. Now, VS Code does include a setting that lets you change which key you need to hold down in order to create multiple cursors. So by default, again, VS Code will use Option or Alt, but if we go and we open the settings with Control, comma, or Command, comma, we can go and say multi-cursor, and here the setting we want is the editor multi-cursor modifier, and this is controlling which key we need to hold down to go and create multiple cursors in a file. So here it's again set to Option or Alt. If we change it to Control or Command, on Windows we would instead hold down the Control key. On Mac we would hold down the Command key to create multiple cursors. So I'm on Mac here, so I'm going to go and set that, and then I'm going to click back into the file. And to create the same cursors now, I would just hold down the Command key, and then I could click on the locations where I want to create the cursors. And sure enough, I'm now using the Command key to go and create the cursors there. Using your mouse to create multiple cursors is not quite as convenient as using the keyboard with Control-D or Command-D, but if you need to create multiple cursors at specific locations in a file, it can be really helpful. I think now is also a good point to look at some of the details of how multi-cursors actually work. Now, if you're just doing basic multi-cursor editing, you might not notice this behavior, but it is important to understand how multiple cursors interact with each other and how they work with things like copy and paste when you get into some more advanced use cases. So let's first take a look and see how multi-cursors are merged together by VS Code when they try to occupy the same space. So to start off, let's go and create two cursors in this code here. And I'm just going to create them a little bit apart from each other just by clicking again. Let me close that. And now as I start deleting here, you'll see that the cursors are moving closer together. And at a certain point, they will actually merge together. And when this happens, instead of having two cursors, we now actually merge those two cursors together and go back to having a single cursor. So again, what was happening here is I created two cursors a little bit apart from each other in the line of code here. And then as I started deleting code and eventually got to the point where the two cursors were occupying the same space, we go back to having a single cursor instead. Now you can also hit this by doing certain cursor navigation type operations. So a really obvious one, for example, is if I'm here in a file, create multi-cursors throughout it, I start arrowing up in the file. As all of the cursors hit the top and go to the very first line and the very first character in it, all of the cursors will merge together until we just have a single cursor again. Another useful one is that if I create multiple cursors in a line here, and then use the go to start of line command, so on Mac that would be Control-A, for example, all of the cursors will jump over to the start of the line, and now we'll just have a single cursor over here again. And when I type the letter A, for example, even though we had multiple cursors in the line, we just get a single A because there is just a single cursor there. Now there is actually a setting in VS Code that lets us disable some of this automatic merging behavior. So let's go and open the settings with Control comma or Command comma, and I'm going to search for multi-cursor, and I want this editor multi-cursor merge overlapping setting here. So this is the setting that is controlling some of that merging. You can see that the default is on, so it always try to merge together cursors. I'm going to go and turn that off instead. And now let's go back and do the same example. So I'm going to create multiple cursors on this line here, and just dismiss that. Go create 4 cursors on this line, and now I'm going to run the go to the start of the line command, so Control-A on Mac, and you can see that I have what appears to be a single cursor over here at the very start of the line. Now watch what happens when I actually press A, for example. You can see that now the cursors have expanded back out, and instead of just getting a single A, I actually have 4 A's. So all of my cursors inserted the letter A. You can now go and see that there are 4 cursors here as I start typing. So it did not merge those cursors together automatically. We actually just have a single cursor still. The same will, of course, happen in the example where we go and we are at the top of the file. So let's go create a few cursors in here. So I'll create 4 cursors again, start arrowing up to the top of the file. We have what appears to be a single cursor up here. I press A, for example, and again, those cursors will expand back out, and each of them has inserted the letter A, so we get 4 copies of the letter A. So we can use that editor multi-cursor merge setting to actually disable the default merging, but I find that the merging is actually quite helpful, and it's usually unexpected, I find, that when you have what looks like a single cursor, that it will actually be multi-cursors in disguise and will end up inserting multiple lines of text or performing multiple operations. Another important detail about the behavior of multi-cursors is how they interact with copy and paste. So to demonstrate this, let's go up to the imports here, and I'm going to go create 2 cursors in the imports. So I'll create one on I, X, to I, and I'll hold down Option or Alt, and then click, and create another one down on cancellation token. Now I'll make 2 selections here. So I'll just select the entire symbols in this case, and then I'll hit copy, so Control-C or Command-C, just to copy the text here. Now I'm going to go back to having a single cursor again, and let's create a little bit of extra space to work with here. So I just have a single cursor, and watch what happens when I now press paste. So I'll press paste here, and you can see that VS Code is actually pasted from both of the original cursor locations, so it has tried not to drop any text, but it has inserted a new line between the 2 cursor text here. And this will happen even if you're selecting on the same line. So if I go up here, I'm going to create 2 cursors again, select a few words here, and then copy again, and I paste. You can see that it has again created 2 lines between the pasted text, and it will create a new line for each cursor location that you're copying from in this case. Now in general, VS Code will always try to preserve the full text and always try to paste that into each occurrence of a cursor. So again, let's go up here. I'll make the same selection I started with. So IXURI and cancellation token. I'll copy that. And now I'm going to go in and I actually create 3 cursors down here. And watch what happens when I press paste now. It'll paste the full text at each cursor location that I was pasting into. There is, however, an important exception to this rule. So that is if you are pasting into the exact same number of locations that you are copying from. So I deliberately chose 3 here because we were copying from 2 cursor locations. So let's take a look at what happens when we paste into 2 cursor locations instead. So I'll just undo this and then go back here. Now I'm just going to create 2 cursors and watch what happens when I press paste now. So when I do paste now, you can see that instead of pasting the full text at each cursor location, it is actually pasted from the corresponding cursor to each of my matching cursors down here. So again, the first cursor when we were doing the copying was up on IXURI. The second one was down on cancellation token. VS Code looked at that and said, hey, we're pasting into 2 cursor locations down here. So we're going to make sure that the first cursor pastes IXURI and the second cursor only pastes the cancellation token text here. That extra smarts can be very helpful, and one case that I find it most useful in is if you are actually creating multiple cursors and then moving those cursors throughout a file. So to demonstrate that, for example, I'll go in here and I'll just create 2 cursors up here and 1 down here. I'll select this entire line and then start moving my cursors down. So I again have just been moving my 2 cursors through the file, and now when I press paste, instead of duplicating those lines, it has actually done the smart thing and pasted just the copied text from each cursor location, because again, I was copying from 2 locations and I'm pasting into 2 locations here. Now let's start wrapping things up by taking a look at a few of the other ways you can create multiple cursors in a file and how these address some of the other use cases for multi-cursor editing. So probably the command I find myself using most often, besides Control-D or Command-D for working with multiple cursors, are the add cursor above and add cursor below commands. And these let you create cursors based on your current cursor position. So again, we had Control-D, which was creating multiple cursors based on the selected text. We had the clicking, which was based on wherever you're clicking in a file. Now we're going to create multiple cursors based on where your current cursor is located in the text itself. Now this is most useful when you're working with repetitive blocks of text or repetitive columns of text. And what I mean by that is take a look over here at the import block here. You can see that every line here starts with the import keyword and then this opening parenthesis in most cases. And these columns are all aligning. So every line here starts with import, and over here in this column over here, we have the end of the import keyword all being aligned. And this is where the add cursor above and below commands really come into play. So say we wanted to go and edit all of these import blocks. One option would actually be I could go and start creating multiple cursors just by clicking using some of the existing tools we've learned. So I could just go and option or alt click here, create multiple cursors just like that. That's kind of tedious though. I could also go in here and actually start creating multiple cursors using Control-D or Command-D. So just going through the list like this based on the opening paren. That might be a little bit fragile, and you can see that we've actually skipped over one of the cases here. So what we really want to do is just go down the entire line here and add cursors so that we have a cursor on each of these lines here, and then we can go in and edit the entire import. Let's use the add cursor above and below commands to do that. So I'm going to just place my cursor on one of the lines here, and now I'm going to go and open the command palette with Control-Shift-P or Command-Shift-P and say add cursor below. And when I run this command, you'll see that what VS Code does is that it adds a cursor on the line below my current cursor position in the same exact column. So again, my cursor was up here originally, and then when I ran this command, it went down 1 line and created a cursor in the same column, just 1 line down. When I run this command again, I'll go and create a third cursor, now 2 lines down from my original one, and I can just keep running this command. There's also a default key binding for this. So on Mac, the key binding is Command, Option, and then the down arrow key. On Windows, it is Control, Alt, and then the down arrow key. So I could just use the key binding here. So Command, Option, or Control, Alt, and then the down arrow key until I have all of the lines that I want selected. And now I have this nice column of cursors here. There's also the add cursor above command, which does the same exact thing, but instead of going down in the file, it actually goes up. The default key binding for that is using the up arrow key instead of the down arrow key. So I'll do Command, Option, up arrow key, or Control, Alt, up arrow key here. Just go through the entire list of imports here until I have the entire block of imports selected. Now I can go and start editing all of these imports all at the same time. So I could do like import type here if I wanted to, just make a very quick edit on all of these imports, just using this column selection, just like this. So super nice. As you start working with more code too, you'll actually start noticing that although these commands might seem kind of specialized, and this might seem like a kind of a contrived use case right here that I was demonstrating, there's actually quite a bit of text that ends up being cursor aligned. So a good example is in JSON files, for example. If you have a formatted JSON file, the start of each item in an array or each object value or each key in an object, for example, that is actually going to be in a column because it has been nicely formatted to have the same indent before it. So if you're wanting to edit all of the values in an array or all of the object keys themselves, you can go and create multi-cursors. If you're wanting to edit all of the properties in an object and there's no white spaces between those property names in a JavaScript file, for example, you can use these column selections. So just having these key bindings in mind can actually be very useful because there's more cases than you'd expect where you can make these column selections instead. Now, a related feature, which is not multi-cursor specific, but definitely ties into multi-cursors and leverages them behind the scenes, is VS Code's column or box selection mode. And what column or box selection lets you do is select a visual box of text in a file. So you can see that normal selection mode lets you select based on lines with all the wrapping and stuff going on here. Column or box selection would let you select a block of text in the code without any of that wrapping going on. Now to enter into column or box selection mode, all I have to do is start making a normal selection and then hold down Alt-Shift or Option-Shift, and I'll go into column or box selection. You can see now that I have this nice box of text that is being selected. So again, I'm selecting over multiple lines, but there is none of the wrapping that is happening, and I'm making a nice box selection here. So when I actually finish this selection, you can see that there's this little blinking cursor over here. And sure enough, behind the scenes, what VS Code is doing to power the column or box selection, it is actually creating a multi-cursor for each of these lines here. So we have a multi-cursor selection for each of these lines, and then there's a cursor here at the line end. So if I actually do a right arrow key at this point, I get multiple cursors. So I have cursors on all these different lines here. I can start making text edits just like that. So behind the scenes, VS Code is using multi-cursors to power column or box selection, and we can use that to our advantage. For example, in the previous case, we were wanting to create a multi-cursor for each of these import statements here. And that was a little bit tedious because we had to hit the up or down arrow keys a bunch of times. Instead, we could use column or box selection to go and make that selection much more easily. So I'm going to start making a selection down here, and then I'm going to go into column or box selection mode by holding down Alt-Shift or Option-Shift, and then just drag upwards here. Not even make any selection, but now I've gone and created multiple cursors. Now I can just have all of my cursors here and make the change that I wanted to very simply. So again, I could just use my mouse to click and drag in that case using column or box selection mode to create multiple cursors without having to go and use the up and down arrow keys a bunch of times there. Column or box selection definitely has other use cases besides multi-cursor, but it can also be a convenient shortcut for creating multiple cursors in a file. And let's wrap things up by looking at a few commands which you might not need every day, but which can be useful in specific situations. So the add cursors to top and add cursors to bottom command basically function like the add cursor above and below commands, except they're adding cursors all the way to the top of the file automatically. So for example here, I'm going to place my cursor on this line. I'm going to open up the command palette with Control-Shift-P or Command-Shift-P and say add cursor. And we have this add cursor to top command. And when I run this, you can see that VS Code has just gone up the current column and added cursors all the way to the top of the file. Again, this is probably something you might not need every day, but it is useful to have there if you ever do need it. And it can be more convenient, certainly, than using the add cursor above command and having to mash the up arrow key a bunch of times. Similarly, of course, there is the add cursors to bottom command, which does the same thing, except to the bottom of the file. So I'll open the command palette again and say add cursors to bottom. And VS Code will now go through the entire file and add cursors all the way to the bottom of the file. So you can see I have cursors on every single line here, all the way to the bottom of the file. And we could now go and make edits like that. And finally, the add cursors to line end command lets you go and add a cursor at each of the line ends for your current selection. So to demonstrate this, for example, I'm just going to go select a big hunk of text here and release the selection. So make that selection there. Now I'm going to open the command palette with Control-Shift-P or Command-Shift-P and say add cursors. And I'm going to go to add cursors to line ends. And when I run this, you can see that VS Code has gone through my current selection, and for each of the lines in that selection, it has added a cursor at the line end for that part of that selection there. So again, this is probably something you may not be using every day, but it is useful to know that it exists, and there might be specialized use cases where this can really come in handy. This video has been an introduction to multi-cursor editing in VS Code. In it, we've looked at some of the ways in which you can create multiple cursors in a file, why you might want to use one technique in some cases or another technique in other cases, as well as some of the more advanced behaviors and settings around multiple cursors. Now, unfortunately, though, I don't think I can actually make you an effective user of multiple cursors. That's really something that you have to learn and experiment with on your own. I encourage you to really start trying to use multiple cursors and then trying to see what you can accomplish with them and then integrating them into your workflow. I started off using multiple cursors in a really basic way, maybe just changing text in a few locations, but they've really changed how I think about making text changes in a file. I use them far more than I ever thought I would. They've almost replaced the find replace functionality for me in a lot of cases, and I really use them quite extensively. But again, it's not something I necessarily think I can teach to you because I use them in a very peculiar way. If you find a cool use case for multiple cursors, be sure to post that in the comments so that others can learn from them. And if you have any questions, I will also try to get around to those if you post them in the comments. I hope this video has been a helpful introduction though, and as I said, I really encourage you to start playing around with multiple cursors and learning more about them on your own. Thanks.